so let's look at Group A. May we have the Group A representative come down and summarize for us? Okay, let's go to Group C. I know they're in here.
No, she's right here.
Oh, you are here. What? Group B?
You're A.
Oh, okay. You should have known.
Isn't that what's supposed to come now? Oh, this is my group. Oh, are we doing the microphone thingy or no? I can stand over there. It's easier. I mean,
No, this is probably the easiest.
Okay, let's go. We don't have much time.
Okay. So yeah, I threw a gauntlet, guys. I need more pictures on your slides too. I mean, I don't know why y'all haven't stepped up, but it's just easy to look up a picture of a polar bear and make everyone smile. So some successful elements. So we had a lot of good conversation, but we also kind of rattled off a whole bunch of things that we decided were really important. Funding was kind of the first word that just popped out. Good communication, both internally amongst a group and externally, and we'll get to that more in a minute. Involving many stakeholders, including policy educators and the general public. Policy going back to having political buy-in is important as well for it to work well. Name recognition, if you've heard of the group that's doing it or the project itself, that lends a lot more weight to these things. Science communication training, so teaching, and that's also under one of the challenges, but being able to teach the researchers how to appropriately and effectively communicate with the public. Minimizing the time commitment that they have to have. Everyone's time is valuable, and so if you can minimize what people have to do, the researchers especially, and I guess the general public. Having outreach embedded in funding, which seems to be the case for many NIH and NSF grants these days, and putting in storytelling, images, beauty, art, all of that. Those are things that are going to catch people's eyes and make anything you do more effective. Challenges, going back again to communication, figuring out ways to support researchers to effectively communicate with the public, and starting early in their careers is important as well. Working with journalists to connect researchers with the public, but then also have them do that in a way without sensationalizing what it is you're trying to communicate, whether you're sensationalizing it positive or negative. How to use social media effectively, also without politicizing. And then to incentivize scientists to want to broaden their impacts, which having the outreach embedded in funding partly does that, but more incentives are always better.
Good job.
Does Group B have a slide? Okay.
Okay, could the representative from Group B come down? Someone has to.
if the group doesn't mind, since I was at the end of the row, I'll just come down. We don't have much. So no pictures?
Hello. So working with communities, this was the idea of that your engagement, right, should, not neglect, right, marginalized or underrepresented audiences. Effectively measuring. Oh, the second point was figuring out ways that you can actually determine whether or not you're being effective. So hooking up, right, maybe these researchers or other speakers with people who can help them get, quick turnaround so they know if they're being effective, right, and that would then lead them to want to be more effective. The third one, getting national press coverage, is validation. So this one, right, we can't just make the failing New York Times come and talk to us, but what we can do, right, is know who's going to, right, we can help get press coverage to help inspire, right, scientists to recognize they're important. This is one we spent a lot of time on, communicating one's accessibility through social media. So it was new to me that journalists and others actually use social media, Twitter and Instagram, to find scientists. So finding ways to get folks who are reticent about social media to actually recognize it's a tool to get them to get, for example, press coverage and then be able to effectively communicate, go back up. And then lastly, we talked again, because I sang the praises of Lisa Bush, who's here, and the Sitka Science Center, but also the Metcalf Institute here at URI, right? And the one thing we noted was in that training, try to match yourself up with the training that you know you need. So for example, I just made a small point that Lisa's group focused a little more on how to work with communities, whereas the Metcalf Institute was a little more focused on specifically working with journalists. It's not that they didn't have some crossover, but getting the right kind of training for the scientists, I think, because there's now so much training out there is significant, or we think. We all did it. Is the group okay with that? Okay.
Sorry, we're having some internet. Okay, we'll go to D.
You can bring it down on a thumb drive if you need to.
Okay, great. I'll try one more thing. Sorry about that. It is. It's from the live stream.
Okay. Oh, from the live stream.
Good background.
Okay.
Yeah.
Woo. All right, so in our group, we had a very lively discussion, and these were the kind of high points that we pulled out. So the first is to involve the public or new audiences at the developing stages of research. It's too late if the project is already way done to get people involved in it, and also to find leaders and stakeholders and representatives in the community who can then also bring your message back to their own community that they know. To leverage existing institutions, take on those informal education institutions, museums, and other resources and use them to your advantage. Build relationships with facilitators and educators, not as a one-time deal, but as someone you can come to over and over again. Invest time and effort in working with those relationships and with partners, and including looking for some high-level win-win partnerships, even if it's a zero-low funding thing, where you refer people back and forth. Oh, I've got a good scientist. Oh, I have a great educator. Those types of things are still worth pursuing, even if they're not necessarily causing your program to, take in money. It's still a good thing to look out for. Looking for broader topics that connect your science to what your audience actually cares about, bridging up to those things that people care about, climate, things that might impact their local environment. Pursuing ways to create sustained interactions, again, with the putting time in and kind of going through as opposed to just kind of coming in, dropping something off and leaving. And exposing scientists to training and outreach opportunities wherever possible. So we had a discussion about, exposing scientists to this very early or even in their early science education, but just any exposure is better than no exposure. Getting to know your audience that you are presenting to and then tailoring the message to them. And we had a couple stories about using a different vocabulary that you would use to talk to someone who fishes for a living versus someone who goes out as a recreational tourist. There are going to be different languages and different things that they care about between them. And then lastly, to expand the ideas of who the partners could be. And that would include people like artists and, again, involve them earlier in the process. All right, group, did I miss anything? Oh, yeah. Put that right there.
Okay, our final group, Group C.
Did you get it to go?
Yes, I emailed it over.
Oh, okay.
It's not pretty, I'm sorry, everybody. It's usually like that. Yes, white. Thank you, Rachel. I'm sorry. This was completely deliberate. Yeah. Artistic design. It's fun. It's nicely organized. Thank you guys, thanks for the support, I appreciate it. We got you. Thanks guys. Yeah. So one of the first things, sort of the top 8 things are some positive things, some things that were actually successful. So we talked about after-school programs, especially with little kids. They talk to their parents. And I think like in the 90s, like the recycling effort was such a big thing because they got involved with children when they were young. So after-school programs are a really great opportunity. to share messages with young audiences, also directly connecting audiences to scientists. So having that direct pipeline, training scientists to better communicate. Some previous groups talked about this. One thing that sometimes scientists, they get these very direct questions like, you know, how do I talk to people that don't believe in climate change? So teaching scientists how to, you know, come up with strategies for that is really important. And so I have some links here that might be helpful. Portal to the Public is one program that helps sort of train scientists with communication. The one really cool thing is if you can't get to conferences, if you're in a remote location, somebody had talked about, you know, going to very rural areas. One of the things is video conferencing with hand-on demos, and I think University of Ohio talked about the rock boxes earlier, which I'm totally going to do. And so I think that's fantastic. Also, high-impact forums. So people talked about this before. Engaging community leaders, politicians were all part of this problem solving. Science lectures in public areas, there's so many examples of this. Festivals, conferences, Science on Tap, where scientists go to local breweries and talk about their research. Science Cafe, Science After Hours, some museums do like really cool programming. Soapbox Science, where scientists actually go in the middle of like very active areas, like in cities, and they literally stand there and they're like, come at me, like, let's talk science, ask me questions, you know, which can, I'm sure, have both positive and negative, I'm sure, experiences, but it really puts you right in the spotlight, you know. And thinking about how to partner with you know, ISEs at the beginning of your grant, you know, thinking about this broader impacts, you know, when you're thinking about the research, since it's just as important, and using them as an opportunity to try out different, you know, outreach opportunities. And learning to communicate different pathways into science. So really talking to people, not just about your research, but how do you get into science? Like, what are the different things you can do with science? I have a lot of students that don't want to do research. I'm sure a lot of maybe your students or people that you work with. And there's awesome people that do ISE, like communicating science. And I think that's a good thing to communicate. And making sure that when we're talking about science, that we're showing diverse audiences all of the different people that do science, so they can connect and engage. And finally, it's a two-way road, getting feedback from the public. So how can the public help us refine our message and make it more effective, right? So yeah, those are just, oh, and one of our less successful projects that we talked about was sometimes we struggle with citizen science, that can be challenging, and there's probably lots of ways where people have done this effectively. Within our group, we said that some of the big issues was sort of communication and sort of how to sort of discuss with them, how to interpret their results and things like that. So that was one that was a little bit more challenging. So anyway, thank you.
Great job. Great job, everybody. And I think having listened to the results of these discussions as well as some of the presentations that we've heard thus far, I hope the scientists in the room have a much broader understanding of all the different kinds of activities that can happen if you partner with an informal science education institution. It's not just about partnering to develop an exhibit, for example. There's all sorts of cool stuff going on, and I hope for the education professionals in the room, you have a sense of all the different science. There's a lot of different science taking place where you can tap into existing networks or existing research projects. And I hope as the rest of today goes on, you can be thinking more and more about partnerships. So with that said, we're going to break for lunch. And so group A and B